before beginning the sermon, I just want to let you know that I prepared for that copies of my sermon for those who forget to bring your hearing aid or not comprehending my English. That would be helpful for those. And you may also bring it to that homebound people, which is your neighbor, and you may bring them and share what you heard today, and we will be still one church, right? So, amen. The peace of the Lord may be with you, also with me. Thank you. So, it is so hard to say peace be with you, or God is good all the time. All the time God is good in this situation, isn't it? So, like I said, we live in the world where we hear about the war, the fastest in human history ever. It is not comparable when the telegraph was invented, when the telephone was invented, or even when radio or TV broadcast started. The news wasn't as fast as it is now. Just saying that, Alexa, what is the today's news? That's it. And we all hear that tragedy from the camp. So we now live in a world where any urgent news from everywhere, even the other side of the earth, can be heard within a minute. That means literally, immediately, from sitting in our bedroom. To what we are saying today's reading of be quick to listen. Think about that. Perhaps we can answer that we already live in that world. That listening, that news is, which is not, I don't want it to listen. However, the Apostle's exhortation today from James, I think that is a little different from living in a world where the news is fast. So I searched for a lot of translation and discovered this would be suitable for our today's understanding. So it is from the Message. James 1:19. Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let angers travel along in the rear. So we find an advice to actively let our ears guide our lives. And it is not passively just listening. So it is let our ears guide our life. So let us start from here. We must be good listeners, even though what we are listening to is not that good news. According to the exhortation given today, I would like to ask you to discover our lives and how can we deal with them by following these three questions. The first one is, what should we listen to? The second one is, what should we say? And third one is, how do we manage our anger? So that first one is, what should we listen to? What to hear? Like you guys, I have had past few days filled with sadness, discouragement, despair, and even anger. I was angry with that news. Regardless of one's political affiliation, it doesn't matter. Or that any opinion on war, like against the war, doesn't matter. No one would have expected to hear this, that our young generation died there. So when I was working in the US Army as the military ambassador between Korean Army and US Army, I was the member of the only transportation battalion in South Korea. And my job was assigning and planning and executing the non-combatant evacuation operation in Korean theater. So I may have few knowledge about what's supposed to happen and what really happened and what is gap between that two things, that ideal one and the real war. So that is big tragedy happened there, and one of my friends from the military say that this case is worse than when the United States withdrew from the Vietnam War, and it stressed me a lot because idea of that history because I was born in 1985 and the Vietnam War is before that, and I only have few information about the reading, the historical books about that. So I may not have the answer, which is worse, but I think you're better than me, right? So you may understand this situation better than me. But let me describe the situation which United States face today. That is rolled down into a huge trap. Like to constantly use the state's resource and money and their people in never-ceasing war. Because that terrorism never stops. To shed the blood of our young generation for a country which will not fight for themselves. That is big tragedy. To allow oppression in the land by withdrawing from that war, which we continue that war to defend that freedom. That is big controversy. Perhaps the United States was in that situation where no matter what decision we make, it was bound to be condemned. There's a lot of traps there. So as I said last week, and all we know about it, the situation now seems like 20 years war is ending like living that hard work and sacrifice of 20 years behind. But brothers and sisters, if there is blood that this nation shed for freedom and liberation, God surely remember that sacrifice. That's where we should start from. If we are on God's side, there will be no doubt of that. God will remember that. God will remember the sacrifice, and God will remember how much effort we put in there. So please forgive me if I say we, even I'm not a citizen, but I feel that solidarity with them. That is why I said we. I think it is Christian virtue that to focus on what we need to hear rather than what it is heard by that mass media. First of all, I want you all to show our solidarity to that soldiers' families who have lost their loved one in the war. Not only for that 13 people, but all the people died there. So according to BBC, more than 3,500 coalition soldiers have died there during the Afghanistan war, and more than 2/3 of them is American soldiers. And more than 20,000 US soldiers have been injured there, and including all the coalition members, that would be a huge number that we cannot count it. So Afghanistan is a country where the other side from the United States, and we may have no idea, or we may thought that it is distant story because we are enjoying our peace here. So that is also controversial. Like our young generation shed their blood there, like many wars. But steadily, our young generation dispatched it to anywhere in the world to keep that freedom and the liberation. And that is that core value of the United States, I think. So we must listen to these unheard stories of the people died there. We should remember their sacrifice. And we ought to honor and be grateful of their service. It is not that we have to close our eyes or ears because it is so painful to listen to it. But we have to continue, open our eyes and ears to know that more and more in detail. That will be better because we will never stop to pray. And we must actively listen to the sorrows behind the news and its victims. Not only for that soldiers, but also that military affiliate, and also for that the people of that land. There are a bunch of that victims there. And Bible tells us this on verse 22 reading today. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. So hearing is connected with doing, Bible says. In his sermon, Almost Christian, Mr. John Wesley said that what distinguishes true Christian from the almost Christian is the truthfulness of one's action. It's not about how much verses we have known. It's not about how much that theological idea we have in us. It's all about what we are doing. So that doing is important in this book, James. If what we hear is true, it will lead us to right Christian conduct. So that is my first focus. We should be good listeners. And the second one, what should we say about this? So the Bible tells us to slow to speak. It does not command us stop speaking, nor does it undermine the freedom of speech. But let me ask you this. What is the difference between listening quickly and speaking slowly? Like, well, if I heard something quickly, I may answer that quickly. But Bible tells us and make a gap, spatial gap, timely gap between listening and speaking. Let me tell you this. So that contemplation and speculation is what we need when we answer to the situation which is overwhelming us. So seeing and hearing the things of the world, the true Christian think of the things of God. That is what we ought not to stop. In sorrow and anger, can we look at our God? I ask you. I found a Christian song named Goodness of God from one of our members' Facebook, and that is one of my favorite. And the lyrics are like this, in that chorus, and all my life you have been faithful, is God. And all my life you have been so good. But when I heard that praise, it was, I believe, yesterday or Friday, after listening that tragedy from the Kabul, Afghanistan, I felt a challenge in my heart. In front of those who have lost their family, in front of the soldiers who have lost their comrades, how dare can I speak of the goodness of God? If they say, well, you haven't lost your family, you haven't lost your comrade, how should I respond with this goodness of our God? Our God is unchanging God, but we are changing. That was my challenge. So brothers and sisters, we may not be able to giving good answer immediately to the event, to the situation, to the circumstance surrounding and overwhelming us. Because the situation around us looks bigger than my experience. We feel that we are so small when this trembling news is overwhelming us. But at that moment, we should remember that, well, I'm that small one, but our God is bigger than any other circumstance, any other situation, any other big tragedy. Our God is there. Our God is the only God. Our God is that biggest God and the true God. So, like that, giving good answer immediately is not possible because that premature answer would hurt someone. But through contemplation and speculation, with prayer, with supplication, we can get closer to the essence of things. That is, that sin is still at the center of our life. That is what I discovered from seeing and watching the news. So I'm not talking about that personal sin because we will not be able to say that victims died for their sin. No, they are not to do it. But I want to speak of that structural sin and the evil that brings sorrow to human and makes people poorer and more sad and brings them in despair. That is what we have to fight against. That is the sin of this world. That is the evil of this world. So I ask you and urge you, let's talk about the comforting God among this situation. He led his people in the midst of the wilderness with a pile of cloud and pile of fire. He himself comforted his people in their suffering as he became himself temple for the refuge. The more space we have between hearing and speaking, or between encountering that news and responding on it, the more we can fill us with the word which the Spirit of wisdom gives us, rather than our own words. So that speaking slowly means think about that, pray for that, contemplating it, and speculating it, and seeking the answer from Him, so that we will be ready to speak the word of God. My third focus is how do we manage our anger? So instead of telling us to stop anger, the Bible still tells slow to anger. This has several meanings, like to stop anger, to reduce anger, to know exactly what anger is, and not to lose holiness. I find it very difficult to speak, as I said, about that sorrow and anger which the United States faces, given that I'm not citizen. I'm immigrant. So I think I may have no right as that kind of classification. But when I was in the military, my US friend, my army friends were there who experienced the battlefield of Afghanistan and Iraq as well, and saw that horrors. That as the first responder of that. So not only that operating the war, many of my friends were there to keep that peace of that poor people. And also, we South Koreans deployed our troops to help the United States military force in Afghanistan, also in Iraq. And I know how that blood of my comrade is precious. So thinking of my comrades, I want to share my heart with you about this situation. So when I first heard about the explosion, I thought it must have been the Taliban, and I started to blame them and showing my anger to them for not keeping their promises. At least they were not to do that. But when I realized that was by that work of ISIS, I became aware of that complicated reality surrounding that situation. On the other hand, the fact that an explosion occurred at the gate, guarded by the US forces, made me angry and suspicious of that if there is failure of military operation, if they have lost their readiness, I was doubtful of that. But when I saw that the reality, it had been filled with many civilians wanting to escape that hell named Kabul, and that it was almost impossible to identify terrorists among them, and that US military forces still keeping their mission regardless of what they can identify. So they are doing their mission at best condition. That thrills me, that impressed me, because they are exchanging their life with their mission. So I rather call it noble sacrifice. Noble sacrifice. And when I heard that sacrifice of hundreds of civilians, along with 13 soldiers, I couldn't control my anger to those who trivialize human life in order to achieve their goals. I cannot stop that anger until now. So think about my sharing story and think about classify my various anger along with that. Something is right anger, something was wrong anger. So I discovered through this experience that when human feels anger, they look for a place to explode that emotion. Like I started to blame the Taliban. So it is easy to express selective anger at something or someone we can easily recognize. But because we are Christian, we have to think of our Heavenly Father's heart as He sees the world, and we must turn our eyes where He sees. So I say Christian anger must be holy anger, even though this world is not holy. It must be about that injustice, lack of righteousness, and the evil structure which makes situation worse and worse, killing people more and more, and making people poor and in despair. So therefore, I hope that all of us would control our heart for righteous anger and keep our prayer before God with that heart. So it is hard to find a good conclusion from today's reading, but we should find the answer. Like every time when I prepare for the sermon, I ask my God, how should we live now? How should we live? More than blaming, or more than, other than blaming, or other than being sad and angry, what can we do at this moment, at this very moment, what can we do? James have to focus on it. That is verse 27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So the first one is to care, and the second one is to keep. The first one, to care, we should remember the families of those who died in the war, and find our concrete actions to help them. We should be able to see the lives of those who are injured and struggling of their life, as we see many people who are begging the money on the street, claiming we heard it from that war. So if we can believe it or not, that is the real situation. Many are hurting of their hearts from that war, and we are due by helping them. Let us also remember that comrades who suffered mentally, even though they were not directly harmed physically through that explosion or get injured. And above all, I want us not to turn away from the pain of civilians, the people who suffered from this war. So that is how we are reacting as our action, not just listening to the word. So we must be a good responder of that word. And second one, to keep, what to do? We must protect ourselves from the world. In Mark 7, which is the gospel part of today's lectionary, Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah, saying that these people announce me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. It's Mark chapter 7. So relying on this word, I exhort you that those who fear God must be different from the world. In all circumstances, God sees whether we honor Him only with our lips or we truly honor Him with our action. Be a true Christian as proving your life with your true action. What we need is not just orthodoxy, that is right teaching, but we need that orthopraxy, that is right action as a Christian. So in that way, the Lord's blessing will be on our true action. Remembering this, and let us pray together.